are from James, and Mark. They bring us a lot to think about and reflect on, both in our world outside these walls, but especially inside during our time of transition. We all have times in our life when we're frustrated, where we let our anger and our frustration get the best of us, and where we need to look in that mirror and watch our judgments. And we need to remember to put God first, and not our traditions, and not what we like. How many of you have ever played golf? Anybody? All right, more power to you. There are times when golf can be one of the most exhilarating games on earth. 2 minutes later, it can be the most frustrating game. Unless you play with me, then it's frustrating all the time. But golf is a sport where you know what you need to do, and sometimes you just can't do it. A golfer sometimes has difficulty putting into practice what he or she knows. And that's pretty much what we're talking about today. Our life sometimes as Christians is like golf. We know what we need to do, but sometimes we just don't do it. And the book of James helps and encourages us as Christians to put into practice what we know. James reminds us that every good thing that is given and every perfect gift comes from our Father in heaven. The blessings of life, our family, our friends, our material blessings, our food, our health, are all evidence of God's goodness in our world. And the question is, the comment is, we depend on God, but can He depend on us? James wants us to know that God doesn't change, but we do. James instructs us to place others before ourselves in order to put into practice what we know. We are often quick to hear, and quick to speak, and quick to show our anger. And that's not what we need to do. Anger is so often our downfall in life. Someone who justifies their temper with excuses can't help himself but make rationalizations. There was a small boy who was passionately angry toward his mother, and later tried to excuse himself in this manner. He was asked whether he ever lost his temper with his teacher, and he said, no. And when asked why not, he said, well, I don't want her to dislike me. He knew he had that unconditional love of his mother. On the other side of the coin, there's a story about a Chinese group of schoolboys who were in the school cafeteria and got so angry with the food they were served that they threw the food on the floor, they broke the pottery. And when their teacher called them in and said to them, would you have done this if I took you to my house? They said no, because we have too much respect for you. We as Christians want God's approval, but we need to remember from 1 Corinthians where it says, love does not insist on its own way. It is not easily provoked. We need to be consistent in our conduct, and he reminds us that our anger and haste does not please God. Applying God's word is our real test in our life. James argues that we deceive ourselves when we don't apply the Bible to our lives. In fact, his are some of the strongest words in all of Scripture that warn of self-deception. It's not enough for us to hear and read the Bible, but we need to put into practice what we read. We all need reminders. We all need encouragement from each other. And we need help from time to time to keep practicing what we know is right. And we know it's not always easy, especially in today's society. We talked about James. It's so easy to look at James and then look at our Gospel of Mark and relate that story to the Pharisees and the disciples. In the opening of Mark, he talks about Jesus and tradition. And Jesus met those Pharisees head on. One has to choose between the commandments of God, those weightier matters of law, and the man-made traditions and their observances. The Pharisees and scribes were looking at the minutiae. They were looking at the little things that they saw. Hand-washing coats, things like that. They didn't see Jesus and what he and his disciples were truly doing. They were worried about their traditions. And they arrived at that situation with their minds already made up. Do we ever approach that in our world? I'm guilty of it. I'm sure many of us are. Think about that this week. The text says, when they gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of the disciples were eating with unwashed hands. It goes on to say that the Pharisees and all the Jews don't eat unless they wash their hands. And it continues to point out some of their rituals and traditions. Those are really good points for hygiene, which we all know. But for the Pharisees and the scribes, those rituals were much more than that. They knew the stories of their ancestors in Egypt, how God had brought them. They knew that while they were in the wilderness, God had given them the law that would keep them for freedom. Those laws were also meant to keep them united as a community in faith. So it was important for them to keep that law to maintain their freedom as a sign of devotion to God. But obeying laws can be complicated. And in many cases, these laws gave very clear instructions on certain ways situations should be handled. Yet in other cases, the law simply provided a moral principle that was often open to interpretation. So an individual or a group or people could apply the principle as they choose. Jesus never denied what his disciples did, and he didn't even justify what they were doing. Instead, he reached way back through the tradition, all the way to Isaiah, and said, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrine." In other words, you intended your tradition to be a fence built around the law. You've built a wall, and it's such a high wall that you can no longer see what you're trying to protect. You no longer understand the commandment that God gave you. And all of these rituals you perform in the name of God mean nothing because your heart is not in the right place. The Pharisees and scribes were so focused on the means and the methods and the forms on how to protect the law that they missed the spirit of the law. We do that today in our lives. It's okay to have rituals and traditions. They're important. But our rituals and traditions can't become our idols. Rituals and traditions are not going to save us. They're not going to make us clean. True cleanliness comes from within. Washing one's hands before we eat doesn't make one clean. And instead of worrying about what people are eating, perhaps we should worry about ourselves and what we are doing. From both of our lessons today, we need to make sure that our inner and our outer selves match. Inner faith produces outer actions, and there's no doubt about it. When you feel like praying, if you come to Bible school, we all say, fold your hands, bow your heads, and close your eyes. That's what we think praying should look like. But if you bow your head, fold your hands, and close your eyes, and think about what else you need to be doing, instead of praying to your Father in heaven, then you're not doing it with the right motivation. The outer you looks good, but the inner you does not. If you love someone and you go up and you greet them with a hug to show your love, you're expressing your inner feelings. If you thoroughly enjoy the company of that individual and spend time with them, you're expressing your inner feelings. Hypocrisy comes up when you display that outer action without those inner feelings. When you bow your head, when you don't feel like praying. When you hug a person you don't like. Judas Iscariot is the best example. When you kiss a person, but you don't use that kiss as an expression of affection. If you spend time with others in order to use them, but you really don't like their company, you're being hypocritical. And your actions are not an extension of what you should be showing. Jesus wants us to know that those Jewish religious supporters had such inner faith that he quoted in Isaiah. These people honor me with their lips while their hearts are far from me. Pretending to be something you're not is hypocrisy. We have to focus on our motivation. Have you ever watched somebody do something and you think you know exactly what they're doing? You might be wrong. An incident just happened a couple weeks ago. I was in the building. There was a person here. I met them. I said good morning to them or good evening. And they said, "Hey, hon, how you doing?" And they had no idea I was a pastor because I didn't wear a collar all the time. If you walk down the street here and you watch one of our Legionnaires walk out, many people have a big judgment about what they think happens with some of these men. And what they don't know is that oftentimes a lot of these men lost their souls, suffer from PTSD, and it's probably the only place where they're appreciated and understood. So, when you see people in situations, we have to not be judgmental about them. And we have to wonder, what is their inner motivation? We need to look in the mirror, as James says. I want to just take a second to look at our traditions. Traditions are necessary. A problem occurs when we put that tradition ahead of everything else. When our actions associated with our traditions become more important than the meaning, we get sidetracked. Sometimes our traditions are our inside story, and it can be so hard to break away from those traditions. One example is this: look around. You don't have to, but as you're shaking hands later today, look around. It used to be that when you came to church, you dressed in your Sunday best. Everybody, ladies wore nylons, heels, dresses, men had on suits and ties. That is no longer the case. There are some people who would say that it's more important to dress up for church than to come to church dressed as you are. So what's more important? Some people carry their Bibles, they come and they bring their offering, they sing their hymns, and they only want the good hymns. And they listen to every word the pastor says. But while the pastor's talking, they're going, man, I hope he's listening to what she's saying, because he needs it more than I. It's not changing their hearts. We often look good on the outside, but our goodness is only skin deep. Worship for appearance is not worship from the heart. When God looks at us, the first thing he sees is the state of our heart. God doesn't care what we look like on the outside. He's more concerned with what's on the inside. He has more sympathy and compassion for a beggar in rags than somebody who thinks it's important to wear fine clothing to come to church. All we have to do is love God with our hearts, not our heads. As we continue in our time of love and transition in this church, I choose personally to reflect on these words and encourage you to do the same. Can we take the time to look past what we think we see about others or what we assume and look for that inner motivation? Can we make sure we truly take that time to look in the mirror and check our own anger and our own judgments and our honesty? I pray that God continues to allow us to grow as a church family, remembering our traditions and looking at each other with wide, open, loving, honest hearts and eyes.